Hello and welcome to Lean in Leander. I'm your host, Andrew Naudine, and in this episode, I wanted to touch on a subject that has come up quite a bit here in Leander, the subject of multifamily developments, apartment homes, townhomes, duplexes, the like. I think it's a good topic to explore a little bit and to help you understand why I would do something like this. We had an opportunity in my subdivision to recently sit down with a developer who was planning to do a project off of Lakeline and to get some community input, which I think is a great thing we do here in Leander. It allows the developers to kind of get a sense of what the temperature is in the area, and as they talk about their ideas and what they're trying to do, help the community understand. So I really do like the fact that we do that. And it gave me an opportunity to obviously give some input to this particular developer. But the other thing that it did is it got me thinking, okay, well, what are we really looking at here in Leander as it relates to multifamily, affordable housing, the number of units? When I've had this conversation with a few people in the past, we've talked about occupancy, which I come from a hotel background, and one of the things we always talk about in the hotel business was occupancy rates. So I wanted to correlate that to occupancy rates for apartments or multifamily developments here in Leander, and that's what started me down this path. So I've put together some information here that I'm presenting to you, the audience. Not trying to persuade you one way or the other, just kind of hopefully just present the facts. And I also have a subject matter expert come in and weigh in on this as it relates to Leander specifically. I had the opportunity to engage with Lyndsay Hanes, who's a property management expert. She's been in that field for over 21 years, and Lyndsay and I have had the opportunity to get to know each other a little bit, so she was kind enough to give me a little bit of her time to discuss this particular subject. So with that, let's go ahead and take a look at what I found as it relates to multifamily units. So when I started to look at the issue of multifamily housing here in the city of Leander, the first focus was on how many new projects were being built and how many units that would bring online and how that might impact the city overall. As I started to do so, I started to ask myself a number of questions. And in order to better understand those, I felt I need to find a good resource where there's a lot of data available to help me understand some of the parameters that affect decisions as it relates to multifamily housing and things that I might not have considered otherwise. So I went to the National Multifamily Housing Council. Now, full transparency here, this is a lobbying group for the apartment industry, and it serves as one of the primary advocates on legislative matters and regulatory matters as it relates to multifamily housing. But with that said, the data that they have is very, very important to understand. And I'm not taking sides on this issue per se. I just wanted to look at some of the data points to see, okay, what does this mean overall? And how can we look at that data, at those data points, and figure out whether we're making the right decisions as it relates to multifamily housing, and how we view it from the perspective of Leander. But in order to do that, we should educate ourselves. So I went to the National Multifamily Housing Council to find some data, which there's plenty of. And I encourage you, if this is something that interests you, to go there and use their data. It's pretty comprehensive. And it really is, I felt, not skewed to one particular look or the other. It was just data. So I like that. I'll start with what renters look like. And these graphics here kind of point out a few things that I want to start with that help us build the overview of multifamily housing and how we should maybe take a look at this from that perspective and then transpose it to what we're doing in Leander. So with that said, about 37% of the renters in the United States live in apartments. About 44.1 million households are also renters. So about 44 million people are renting homes, and about 37% of the renters in the nation, they're renting apartments. So those two numbers are important to understand because it kind of gives us a sense of where those people are and how they're living. These are folks that maybe can't afford to buy, maybe don't want to buy, and so it's important to kind of understand where those numbers come from. Another thing that I found here that was really interesting to me is that out of the 44 million households, about 5.4 million are single women, which I think is an important factor in the way you look at this overall. Okay, I'm not going to dwell on that point too much, but it did pop out at me as something that was, hey, this is kind of important when you're thinking about this. There's about 21.9, almost 22 million apartment units in the U.S. Obviously, that's growing. About 40% of those apartments are two-bedroom units. And the reason I bring that up is we're going to look at some data a little bit further here that will kind of explain why that is. Now, for context, I wanted to point out that there's about 3 million apartment units in California. And the NMHC actually called that out in one of the reports that I looked at. So I thought it was important to feature that as it relates to Texas, because it's important to kind of juxtapose those two pieces, I think. And the reason why I felt that was when I looked at the distribution of new apartment construction in the year 2020. So this was just last year. There was 67,295 new units that are coming online in the state of Texas. And it was also, Texas is one of the top 5 states for new construction. I believe it's number 3 overall. And that has a pretty substantial economic impact because construction equals jobs and jobs equals spending. So we need to look at that as well when we look at this from a holistic point of view. I think it's important to understand all of those various factors before we make a decision on whether we want to support new construction or maybe slow it down. So when I started to look at that, I was like, okay, well, why are there so many new apartments being built? What's the need? And a lot of us have seen on the news where housing is in shortage, affordability of housing is an issue. There is a really section of our economy that is driven by new homeowners, new apartment renters, people leaving college, etc., who maybe cannot afford a new home or don't have the flexibility within their budgets, so they're renting. There's also the whole Gen Z, Gen X factor where they're a lot more mobile than generations in the past. They move around a lot and they're not so inclined to put down roots. And those who are putting down roots are actually putting down roots a little bit later. I saw something the other day that said women are later into childbirth, and there's actually a decrease in the number of children being born because women are waiting longer to have children. So all of that factors in when we look at this. So getting back to the rental apartment vacancy rate, it's right around 8%, okay? So that means there's not a whole lot of units available, hence the new units being built. But with that understood, it's important to look at absorption rates. And absorption rates are basically, as the new inventory comes online, how quickly is it being converted to occupied units? And when you look at this, you see that within 3 months of construction, almost 57% of those units that are new to the market, whatever market it happens to be, these are national numbers, mind you, they are absorbed. So those are rented. So fully half of the inventory, as soon as it comes online, within 3 months, it's rented. When you look at 6 months, you have about 78% of the units absorbed. So very quickly, within a short period of time, when those units are coming online, they're becoming occupied. So apartments are filling up very quickly, is what you can gather from that data. Now, what I also wanted to take a look at was, how big are these properties? And when you look at this, you can see clearly that over half of the apartments that are being built are properties that have 100 or more units. So again, when you juxtapose this particular information over how quickly they're being absorbed, if we say there's 100 new units coming online, within 6 months, 75 units are rented. So there's only 25 units left, and that's within the space of a year. So that's important to understand as we move forward, because those types of numbers affect the demand for these units, okay? So that's something that we need to keep in mind when we're talking about this. The type of structures that renters live in also tells us something here, okay? So when we look at residential residents, or rental residents rather, you can see that about 40% of rental residents are renting single family. So that kind of goes to that factor of the homes, where, I'd say 40% of renters are renting homes. Okay, they can't afford to own, but they do rent. All right. Then you start looking at the rental for 2 to 4 units, 5 or more units, and then you get the other 50%, approximately. A small number of people do mobile homes. It's a very small number. So for our conversations as far as multi-unit or multifamily units, it really is negligible from that perspective in the arguments that we're making. And frankly, the mobile home thing is not even something that we're talking about. But it's important to point out that is another way that people are housing themselves. Now, when we look at this from the number of renters versus the number of owners, you see that is very much along the lines of those numbers we saw in the very first screen on our deck, where we were talking about the percentage of renters living in apartments at being 37%, and the household, 44.1 million households being renters. Those numbers, that's what you see here. You see fully more than 60% of households are owner occupied, which would leave about 40% that are renters. And that kind of calculates. If you're saying it's out of a million people, that kind of starts to make sense. When you look at the residents, same thing holds true. So we can kind of see that those data points are telling us that there's approximately about a 35 to 40% of the population who either rent because they want to rent or rent because they have to rent. They don't have other choices as far as affordability and things of that nature. They may not be able to buy a home, which is important because they're either renting a home or they're renting an apartment. Now, we talk about density when we talk about multifamily, and density starts to become kind of like an X factor or a boogeyman to a lot of people. I know in my particular instance, I've looked at this and said, hey, there seems to be a lot of people living in that house when it's a rental. And when you look at that, you can kind of see that does hold true for homes. Okay, so with households, approximately 29% is just one person living in the house. But then there's about 33% that's 2 or more people, and then again another 15% that's 3 or more people, and then again another 21% that's 4 or more people. So that holds true, that there can be a larger number of people living in a home that is being rented. However, when you look at apartments, that doesn't hold true. So clearly 50% of apartments are a single person. Then you have about 29% that's 2 people. So right there's 79% of all apartment dwellers is either 1 or 2 people living in that apartment. Another 20% is 3 or more. So that kind of takes away the argument, if you will, that there's a lot of people jammed into the apartments. There's actually fewer people by household living in an apartment than you could potentially see living in a home. So that's another factor to take into account when we're looking at this overall issue. Now, this again kind of just supports what we were talking about right out the gate. A lot of young people are renting homes, renting apartments. When you look at this and see the 30 to 44, that's up over 20 to 23%. I think when you take those tabulations and you look at it over historical data, that's more than has been historically there. So between those two, you're looking at, again, about 70% of the population is younger than 44 years old. And that makes a big impact in who we're talking about when we're talking about multifamily. Now, the number of vehicles per household is another issue that, again, when I look at this from the perspective of homes versus apartments, there's a big boogeyman with apartments. Hey, there's a lot of cars, there's a lot of new people living there, yada, yada, yada. But the data doesn't really hold that out. You can see here that fully more than 25% of people living in apartments don't even have a vehicle, okay? So when you combine that with those who do have one vehicle, you're now looking again at that 75% threshold where people have 0 to 1 vehicle and live in an apartment. However, when you look at that from the homes, it's a little different. You see that in homes, there's almost an equal distribution between 1 to vehicles, around 30%, 32, 35% respectively, 1 or 2 vehicles at each house. But then you see, comparative to apartments, 21% with 3 or more vehicles compared to 3-4% in apartments. So again, here, homes are more of that dense number of people, larger footprint, if you will, than apartments are. From that perspective, just simply talking about how many people within each individual unit, how many cars within each individual unit. So again, an important data point to kind of understand and know. Again, these numbers are national, so this is not something that necessarily translates specifically to Leander, but it's important in understanding that overall because those trends do tend to, in a more of a micro, hyper local perspective, bear out. Okay, so economic impact is another thing that I think is super important to talk about when we're talking about the multifamily homes. And I was able to use an economic calculator here, and I wanted to do a comparison between a couple of different factors to kind of help people understand what this could potentially mean. All right. So when we look at the economic impact of all the new builds in Leander, the ones that have been approved or pending approval or under construction today, it's about 10, 11 projects more or less. And we're going to look at that in a moment. That economic impact alone is about $737 million. All right. So the tax revenue impact there is $33 million. And that's an important number because that's tax revenue impact in your metro area. And I had to use Austin here because it was the closest I could get to Leander, but it does still translate to that. Those numbers still make sense when we're looking at it from that perspective because the number of units is what we're looking at, not necessarily the specific area. And since I was able to bring this down to Austin, it's Austin Metro, and so we can make some fair assumptions here that those things will hold out at the end of the day. So tax revenue, nice impact. The total jobs supported, about 3,300 jobs supported with the build of those 1,355 new units. Now, when we add in Northline, and this is important because that's a huge development, okay? When you add Northline into this economic impact, it brings up the total number of new units, apartments, townhomes, etc., to about 3,655 units. When we factor that in, the economic impact now becomes $1.98 billion with a tax revenue impact of 90 million. So those are big numbers at the end of the day, and it's important to factor that in when you're making a decision about how you move forward as a city. We talk about this a lot in Leander, about the tax and how much the tax is and how much revenue we're getting and yada, 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 yada. And I think far too often that's a very, very small, narrow focus on those tax revenues. When we start to open this up a little bit more and start to take a look at this from an overall perspective, that's a much bigger tax impact. The total number of jobs supported then is about 9,000 jobs. Now, again, those are not necessarily jobs in Leander, and I understand that, but those jobs that are taking place in Leander, they create spending. Those people are going out to eat. They're buying from local convenience stores or grocery stores. Just in the construction industry, there are food trucks and things of that nature. All of that is going to have some local impact. Maybe not to that degree fully, but from a metro perspective, from our footprint here in Leander, that's what we can look at. And we can say, okay, hey, these are some approximate numbers of what kind of impact this is going to have. So if we do nothing else going forward for the next, let's just say 3 years, we build 0 more apartments, we build 0 more multifamily units. Just with Northline and what's already been approved, we're looking at about $90 million tax revenue windfall from those. So keep that in mind when you're making arguments on other issues, because I think sometimes people focus in far too much on the smaller pieces and don't look at things from a more holistic perspective. The other factor that comes in here, to be perfectly frank and to be perfectly fair, is that when the city is making decisions on lessening the tax rate or giving incentives and things of that nature, it comes out of those numbers. Okay? So we have to look at that. We have to be aware of that. And when we factor in all of these data points into our conversations, those are some things that we need to be thinking about. So let's talk about Leander multifamily. And this is going to segue into my guest. For Leander, there, as I said, there's about 10 or 11 units that are currently under construction. The development map that you see here is actually available through the Leander website. I believe it's relatively updated based on any kind of council decisions or P&Z decisions. So this is current as far as publicly available information. And you can kind of see from this map where a lot of that is kind of taking place in that corridor between Hero, 183, 183A, San Gabriel. That whole area is really kind of where there's going to be a lot of urban density. We already know that that's going to happen. This kind of just further illustrates that. But what I wanted to do is kind of help people understand exactly what those projects look like and where they're located basically, so you understand what the impact is already. If you look at the Alta Leander station, that is over again off of Hero Way. There are already the standard Leander station apartments that are built out there. So it's all in that kind of area where Northline and all that will be taking place. Now the 276 units coming online there. The Arroyo Roble townhomes, again off of 183, kind of near that where Whataburger is and where the Holiday Inn is. You see that construction, you see a lot of that going on right now. Another 185 units coming online there. The Avon Ridge Apartments, a little bit further to the east off of San Gabriel, another 312 units coming online. You see Blake's Bend, which is in the area between 274, kind of near Mason Creek Park. So, just a little east of Bledsoe. There's another 72 units coming online there. And right across the street from there is going to be the Granite Height townhomes with another 96 units. The Hills at Leander is another 228 unit construction. They're off of 183, a little north of Crystal Falls. the retreat at Hero Way, which is a little bit further west on Hero towards Lakeline, near Sharksburger, the original Sharksburger. Shout out to Dino. And that's about 100 units or so. I couldn't get a clear idea of exactly how many are there. Those are townhomes. It's a gated community from what I understand, so kind of an interesting addition there to available inventory. And there's also the West South Street duplexes, which are near Old Town, kind of in that Old Town Leander, near the LISD, or approximately that area. There's another 86 units going up there, duplexes. If you ran the 5K, I think we ran by those new duplexes going up, so that gives you a sense of where those are. All of these units are, again, either under construction or currently approved for the city of Leander. So we know that that total 3566 number is where we currently sit as far as how many more units are coming online. So it's important now to kind of change our focus and talk to my guest about, okay, well, what's currently there? How does occupancy look for that? And is this new build, are all these new builds warranted to a degree? So let's talk to Lyndsay about that. So now I'm joined on this episode by a friend and a subject matter expert, Lyndsay Hanes, who is the president of property management, Metric Property Management. She's also the secretary treasurer of the Austin Apartment Association and a board member of the Texas Apartment Association. So Lyndsay, thank you so much for joining me here on Lean and Leander.
Great. Thank you, Andrew. Thanks for having me.
And just so that everybody knows how I know Lyndsay, and actually this is the first time we've ever had FaceTime together. No, I take that back. We did have one other Zoom meeting a while back. We've been trying to put this together for a bit. Lyndsay is married to Steve Hanes, who briefly ran for city council this past election cycle and apparently has his eyes on 2022.
I heard that rumor too.
I went to the website today. I saw it there. I think it might be something that he did on purpose. I don't know. But Steve was a great guy. I really enjoyed talking to him. And I've really enjoyed having the conversations with you on this very subject matter, because I think it's something that for the citizens of Leander, for people who have these conversations and leadership, if you will, just for, make it a little bit more broad-based, I get the sense that not everybody looks at this with a holistic view. And what I've tried to do with this episode is really kind of highlight everything that multifamily means to the city, to an economy, and to the people who, hey, we're all looking for a place to live at the end of the day. And not everybody can buy a house. And so what I wanted to do was to be fair to the subject matter and talk about it really just based on the data points. So to bring you in as a subject matter expert, I really want to kind of start diving a little bit more into Leander specifically, because we've already made some points about some general data, kind of leaned into that a little bit and hopefully showed things that maybe people don't think about normally. But when you and I were talking about Leander specifically, one of the questions that I had right out the gate, and it's something that I've asked in situations where I've been talking to leadership in Leander, is, does anybody know what the occupancy of the apartments is today? Because I think it's really important to understand, are there enough units? Are they available? Is there any availability there? I come from a hotel background, and so we always looked at that. It was always occupancy rates. So you and I did a count, and there's approximately, this may not be accurate to the number, but it's pretty close, because you have that kind of data, and that's where we took it from. There's about 3,965 units available in Greater Leander as of today, correct?
Available for occupancy. Yes, certificates of occupancy in hand. That is the right number.
Okay, so basically they can rent those. They can rent those units,
Yes.
right? Okay. So when we look at that, and again, I'm kind of leaning on Lyndsay here because she was kind enough to share some information with me about what's going on in Leander. And when we look at available units, this is current inventory. I'm struck by a couple of things. So, for instance, when I look at all of these hotels, this list hotels, sorry, force of habit, I guess. All of these apartment complexes or these multifamily units. The one that I would kind of remove from our conversation is like the Sky Luxury Center, because that's senior living, and that's a little bit of a different animal to the conversation here. I'm not saying that it's not necessary as part of our multifamily planning process, but it is very specific. Would that be a fair statement?
Sure. It's a totally different type of housing with some services included that's much different than just general multifamily apartment communities. I'd also consider excluding the communities that have just recently opened. For instance, the one that's 20% occupied currently just opened. So I look at stabilized occupancy. Those that have already reached the 90% or more are now stabilized, and of those had occupancies of about 96% for Leander.
Yeah, which was really quite. Again, the data that I've looked at supports that right now. Obviously, because there is a, I wouldn't say a crisis, but there is a lack of available housing overall. There's demand in the marketplace, and as the fastest growing city in Texas, if not the country, Leander, that's uniquely highlighted right now because there's so many people coming here. They're looking for places to live. Whether they're filling those apartments on a temporary basis while their home is being built, or maybe they just want to live in an apartment, I thought that was really quite eye-opening because across the board, and I'll share this little graphic in the episode, almost without exception, they're above 95%.
Yeah, that's 100% accurate. And I look at the cities around us that are our size, and they have double the amount of apartments that we have. Their occupancy rates aren't quite as strong as Leander. The demand there is high as well. So there's absolutely a need for housing for all kinds of people. And people don't just live in apartments because they can't buy a house. People decide to live in apartments. I've had doctors and lawyers and veterinarians and very wealthy retired people who've lived in my apartment communities all in Central Texas. So sometimes it's a lifestyle choice.
Yeah, no, definitely for sure. And again, here the data really supports that. I think there is a subsection currently that the youth or younger families, younger couples, or young people in general. So when you look at like Gen Z and millennials and the green peas, we'll call them, they are much more mobile as a rule than most. They move around a lot, whether it's for job, whether it's just because they're still kind of finding their way in the world. But there's a lot more mobility there, and there was a huge percentage, and I don't know what it is here in Leander, maybe you do, but there was a good strong percentage of people who were, I think it was 44 and under, with a majority of that being 30 and under. Can you speak to that? Like, what do you see in Leander in general? Who's occupying these I keep doing that, these apartments?
So it's challenging to get that specific data because there are some privacy policies in place that property managers have to be respectful of. So a lot of that data comes from the property management software companies that on the back end can do a sweep and extract data, but it can't be specific. So unfortunately, my opinions come from the property managers that I know that are managing in the city. And I've gone to many of them and said, what kind of people live here? What are their professions? What are their backgrounds?
Right.
What are their goals? And I would agree with you. I think we have a heavy 28 to 42 multifamily demographic. It's really hard to get information regarding the school district and how many children really live in apartments.
Hmm.
That's a concern. I mean, if our schools are popular and overburdened as is, and you build an apartment community, what's that going to do to the school district? But one of the largest apartment communities in town sat down with me and shared that she has 7 children that get off the school bus in front of her community. So it's not heavy on families or high density or high occupancy for apartments,
Hmm.
rather, and it's 28 to 42 young professionals. A lot of single people, not even a high percentage of married people in apartments that have just made that lifestyle choice.
It's really very interesting because again, at the start of the episode, I kind of took a very large holistic view at this from a national level, and I looked at information that was available, data that was available, and to those points, what you're saying about Leander, and which was I was making the assumption, but you're kind of validating the assumption, is that the trends that we see nationwide really will reflect themselves even in our community here in Leander, which at this point, what was it? A couple of months ago, we were pushing 80 or what is it, 80,000, and so now we're probably closer to maybe 90 now. I know that the projections are about 150, maybe a little 180, somewhere in about that range within the next couple of years. So, from that perspective, from a percentage of population, and I think again, I want to kind of lean on your expertise here. What generally is considered a mean or a norm, if you will, based on total population? How I know there was some things that I saw in the data that said about, I don't know, about 40% or so a rental. But what does that really look like? What's the reality there?
Well, if we look at Round Rock, similar population. They have quite a few more apartments than we have, and I've done that calculation too. I didn't make many friends when I posted about this, but for a city of our size, um, we would need 27,000 apartments today, with certificates of occupancy in order to be in line with nationwide averages for rental housing.
Wow. So even with the new inventory coming online, which there's around 3,600 units if you include Northline, which is a little bit longer perspective as far as the projections there. Some of these units that I've reviewed already are projects that are currently underway here in Leander that are going to add, what was it, around 1,500 or so units. And then you add Northline in, comes up to around 3,600 total. And so if we add that to the number that we talked about earlier. Let me find that number again. The 39. So let's say 4,000 plus another 36. So that's 7,600 units. That's still way off of where a city of our population would necessarily need to be. Is that fair?
It is, and to give you some history, if you look at the city's website, you'll see the plans for a dozen apartment communities that get you to the 10,000 plus new units coming down the pipeline. But just a little history lesson: my very first property manager position, I was the manager at Lakeline Apartments in 2008 until 2011. And it was one of 2 multifamily apartment communities in the city. The senior community over by HEB came up a few years later. But I personally watched the construction and development plans out of sheer curiosity. What kind of competition is coming? And
Mm-hmm.
multifamily is what I do. And,
Mm-hmm.
quarter after quarter, we'd see multifamily proposals come up on the construction report and planning and development and fall off. And I'm not saying that everything that's on the city's website is a fairy tale. However, they're in various phases of construction, development, permitting, and I'm on all of those developers' list for investment. They're still getting their investment. They're still getting their financing. And so some of those apartment communities are never going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
They won't get approved or they won't get funded. Those deals fall apart, and that's very, very common. And to your point with Northline, that's a what 20-year project.
Mm-hmm.
And in 20 years, we'll wish that we started years ago, because there was a good 10 years there where no multifamily development happened whatsoever. And I do understand why everyone says there's apartments everywhere, but
Mm-hmm.
it's because we got so far behind,
Mm-hmm.
and now we're catching up, and we have a great city that people want to live in.
Yeah, I think it's a fair point. And one of the other things that I think people in general don't account for is the economic impact of those projects. And I highlighted that earlier, where you're looking at. Let me pull it up over here for myself. When you look at this, for instance, even if you just take, well, let's not even do that. Let's talk about the total economic impact of all the currently planned properties. Okay, that includes Northline. For our area, and again, I was able to use some pretty solid sources to get to these numbers. It's over a billion. It's actually $1,988,000,000 of impact, total economic impact for our metro area. That again, I had to use Austin to get to that number because it didn't go all the way down to Leander. But that's probably going to be pretty close to a reality, right?
Absolutely. And a few months ago, I did a fun exercise and picked one apartment community in Leander, and I went to the Williamson County Central Appraisal District, and I looked up what their property taxes are. It would blow your mind how much property taxes multifamily in general pays. And then let's assume it's not a 400 unit apartment community and it's 10 acres, and we're restricted by the amount of single family that we can build on those 10 acres. If it were subdivided, the property tax income would be so much less
Mm-hmm.
compared to what the multifamily property tax is paying.
Mm-hmm.
And the renters share in on that expense. It's absolutely part of their rent, whether they understand or consider that. It's part of the rent, and that's their contribution to the city.
Yeah, I think it really was for me. That was a little bit of an eye-opening exercise, in just in understanding not only the economic impact, but the tax revenue. And to your point, that economic impact, and we mentioned it earlier, it's $90 million in tax revenue for the metro, just with what's currently scheduled to be built. Okay, and so I think it's really important for us as citizens to understand that, because we do have a propensity to say not in my backyard. And I understand that too. I mean, as a homeowner, if someone came in with a plan and they were going to build a let's just say a 3-story apartment complex directly in my purview, in my vision, I would probably not be super happy about that. I don't know that I'd welcome them with open arms, to be honest. I would probably fight back a little bit. I'd push back as a citizen, say, hey, wait a second, can this go somewhere else? One of the things that I find that's really interesting here in Leander as I watch this process work its way out is that it's curious to me, and I'd like to get your impression of this, is the and I'm not pointing fingers, and I'm not placing blame, but I think because we're catching up, because there is a genuine need, in my opinion, there's not a whole lot of thoughtfulness going into how we're managing that process outside of the urban density that's going to naturally be created in the Northline area. In that Northline project, that's going to be super, super dense there. It's already getting there. So we know that that's going to happen. And what we were talking about what? About 10,000 units. And we need basically twice that, honestly, to support the population, right?
I think we got to 3 times that. So,
Okay.
yes.
So where do those go? I think that becomes the question. Where do we do that? How do we facilitate that growth, and do it in a sensible, logical manner, that is keeping with what the city is trying to make itself. Again, I think it's Carlos St. James who refers to Leander as an adolescent, and I think it's a great way to think about the city, trying to figure things out, still not necessarily pulling all the puppet strings correctly yet. So, from your perspective, what are some thoughts there? And I'm interested to see, because you're a professional, and obviously increased competition makes your job a little bit more difficult, but it's part of the job. It's part of anyone's job when you're in a kind of a sales oriented, facing. What are your thoughts there? I'd be interested to know.
So I am a proponent of both sprinkling apartments throughout instead of having the apartment central. I think Northline has its purpose, and eventually it will be a beautiful domain-like hub for the city, and that's great. But I'd like to see apartments sprinkled out more around the city. That will alleviate any perception of burden on taxes, help with roads and infrastructure. But that's really challenging because I think Leander has a reputation for being very anti-apartment, and that's previous leadership or deals that have not been approved. We have a reputation, there's no way around it, for not being friendly about working with multifamily developers. So there's not a bunch of multifamily developers just begging and borrowing trouble to develop in Leander.
Right.
Change that perception, and we were more developer friendly and stopped with some of this overly restrictive zoning and building restrictions that we have in place right now. We might attract developers who would be willing to part ways with some of their large plots of family land in prime locations for multifamily.
Yeah, it is a valid point, and I think it does bring up, obviously some additional structure to the conversation. It's hard for me. Again, I'm newer to Leander. I haven't been here long. How long have you lived in Leander?
Full time since 2008.
Okay, so since 2008, I'm 3 years here. So in these conversations, I find it very interesting because there is, like you said, I think there is a bias against apartments and multifamily units. I think it's more effective to talk about it as multifamily units because that really is more the reality there, in my opinion, because it then it starts to encompass townhomes, duplexes, things of that nature, things that may not get the same type of pushback as a larger apartment complex. And it's unfortunate for those apartment complexes, I think, in general, that there's a sentiment that there's there that way. I think what you're pushing up against is the rural nature of Leander historically. It's been wide open spaces, and people like their space out here. So it's harder to think about this urban density. But it's a natural component of where we're going. It's going to happen. So I think it's more important for us to do an approach that makes sense, not only for the benefits that it brings to the city, because that density, we've already talked about the tax benefits and things of that nature. But I think there's also a need for affordable housing. I know you've lived here long enough to see it. I've lived here long enough to see it too. The increase of the property values out here has been significant, partially due to the pandemic and some other factors, but you never go back. I mean, in my lifetime, I've never seen a deflation really long term of property values. You know, they always continue to increase. And we live in a very affluent environment. Our city has higher than average incomes, higher than average educations. So I think it's important for us to recognize that, but at the same time, understand that affordability is part of an issue that multifamily addresses.
So the average rate of a one bedroom apartment in Leander, excluding the services included senior, is about $1,150 a month. Some as high as $1,250, and that's just for a one bedroom apartment. And a fun exercise is you must make 3 times the amount of the rent in order to qualify to live here at any apartment community in Leander. And that's more than the salary for teachers here, for police officers, for firefighters and EMTs, much less retail workers or food service or food industry. You know, and any entry level position cannot qualify for an apartment in Leander.
Now, is that qualification something that's driven by, you know, the apartment associations? You know, that everybody's agreed that, hey, there's this level of income capability that we need to maintain in order to do these units, or is that something that Leander has imposed?
It's just a general industry accepted qualification. Each owner, developer, managing agent decides what their qualifying criteria is. 99% of the time, it's 3 times the rent, similar to how you have to have an income to debt ratio whenever you buy a house. It just has to
Right.
be affordable.
Right, right. Well, you know, again, those that may be a barrier of entry to some people, um, and how do you address, you know, more affordable housing, you know, at the lower end of that particular spectrum, so that, you know, again, you don't want to create a situation where people cannot afford to live here, because as the city grows and as we add all of these various you know, factors of you know, let's just call it entertainment venues, or you know, consumer venues, restaurants, things of that nature, which we hear talked about. Those people aren't going to be able to afford to live here. So where do they live? And I think that's part of the equation that honestly I think is a struggle for some of the leadership and even for city planners as well.
So I think that some of the zoning restrictions contribute to the overall cost of construction. But I've said many times that if you made a developer lace it in 24 karat gold, they're still going to build in Leander if they can get approval. It's not favorable, but overall, we have so much demand here that it will be built one way or the other if they can get the multifamily zoning approved. So we're so far behind that there's no way to make the next round of apartments affordable and draw more people, you know, people that we know deserve to live in Leander. And you probably covered the absorption rate already, but you know, 23% absorption in just 60 days in our submarket. So as quick as you can build it, it fills up.
Yeah.
And we are missing true affordable housing. And I don't mean, you know, maybe a fair price for a one bedroom should be $1,000, not $1,150. I mean, genuine income restricted, affordable housing
Hmm.
with developments that have land use restriction agreement and supportive services. And I come from a long background of low income housing tax credit, which has a negative sound to it, but it's not at all. You must make at least under 60% of the area median income, which is pretty darn high because we are in an affluent area, like you said. And the rents are restricted to be affordable within that income level. And in exchange for that, those communities offer child care services, you know, tutoring for children, after school programs, GED, stuff, all sorts of social services to really help people to graduate into a place where they can afford to purchase a home and still live in a safe, comfortable, affordable apartment community. And there's nothing like that in Leander.
I was just about to ask. I was like, I'm not aware of anything like that in Leander. So that's another little wrinkle to this. I don't want to say issue. I don't want to say problem. It's a challenge. It's just, we're going to have to address this as a community, in my opinion. Now, I don't think this is something that can necessarily wait again, because we're unfortunately in a position that people made decisions. I don't know for sure, these are my opinions, of course, speculative, but they made decisions to wait on a lot of this type of stuff, and now we're kind of like, okay, we got to do these things, and these things are multiple, and one of those multiples is multifamily, affordable multifamily, and just really inventory availability, which I would equate to this. I worked in the hospitality industry in Houston, Texas, when Houston made a huge investment in their downtown area. They wanted to reverse the attrition of the central hub in Houston. They did it, and they did it quite successfully. And from my perspective, when I was in the hotel industry, we did not have sufficient inventory to be able to support conventions and Super Bowls and things of that nature. We were pushing out way beyond the city limits of Houston to be able to facilitate those things. That's not true anymore. There's a tremendous amount of inventory in the city center and in Midline, Midtown for Houston as well. So the equations are a little bit different now, but they needed to do it to provide economic development for the city. I think that's the same thing here in Leander. What would you say?
I would agree, and we have to start by being open to conversations, not necessarily saying no. This might not be right in this particular plot or at this time, or your plans are terrible. But let me perhaps set you up with someone in P&Z who can guide you into coming up with a plan that everyone can be on board with. And that all starts with better relationships with developers and being open and flexible, because the apartments they're going to come, and we should control that dialogue.
I agree. And I think that's really, at the end of the day, that's probably where I would want to make the point is, I think it's fair to understand that homeowners are resistant to the idea of multifamily, especially not in my backyard. And I understand that. I get that. But I think as a city, we also have to do a better job of helping people. And that's what I've tried to do here with this episode, is try to help people understand all of the factors that come into play with those decisions and that decision-making process. Hopefully, I would think, city planners and the leadership in the city of Leander are looking at these factors when they're making those decisions. I really don't know which side of the fence to fall on there, to be honest with you. I don't have an opinion as it relates to that. I think some of the decisions that have taken place in the recent past were maybe not long-range planning from that perspective, maybe a little bit more reactionary. But again, I get it, because if that's what your citizens are saying, that they don't want this kind of thing, you kind of have to try to balance those two things and walk that fine line. But I think today, and with this episode, I think we've highlighted some areas where we really need to look at this a little bit differently and a little bit more holistically. I appreciate your participation.
Thank you for having me. It's great to live in a city where everyone wants to be, and I appreciate the opportunity provide a little bit of insight. And thanks for the great presentation that you put together.
Oh, great. Well, that pshaw. I really, Lyndsay, you were super, super helpful to me kind of understanding this. And I want to thank you for your time here on this episode, as well as previously we've had some conversations that really kind of helped me kind of move this in a direction I felt comfortable with, kind of highlighting these things. So I agree with you. I think everybody really loves to live in Leander. We're trying to make sure that Leander stays Leander-ish. But at the same time, we have to recognize, hey, it's going to grow, it's going to get bigger. Let's control that narrative. Let's make sure that we understand how that's going to look, and don't have to make off the cuff type of decisions. I think hopefully I've done that today and help people understand this topic, because I think it's important. Again, appreciate your time, Lyndsay, so much. Look forward to seeing you when we get a chance.
Yeah.
And tell Steve I said hey.
All right. Thanks so much, Andrew.
All righty.
All right.
So I want to thank Lyndsay again for her time. I appreciate her taking a little bit out of her day. We spent some time trying to coordinate this. It's been a few weeks, to be honest, but I was happy to be able to get that conversation in and share it with you, the audience here in Leander. So if you like what we're doing here at Lean in Leander, obviously take a second, hit that subscribe button or that like button, and let us know what you're thinking. And if you have any ideas for us here at Lean in Leander, by all means, feel free to visit www.leaninleander.net and pass a message on to me, and I'll be happy to take that into account as we move forward for the next episode. So we're closing in on episode 30, which is crazy, but it's been fun, and I hope you enjoy the content. Thank you so much for your time, and we'll see you next time.